In the sprawling history of the British royal family, some names echo through centuries, while others vanish like ghosts. This is the story of a ghost, Alastair Windsor, a boy born a prince, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, who was destined for a life of immense privilege. Yet his story is a tragic footnote defined by loss and failure. By age 3, his princely title was stripped away by a king's decree. As a young man, he was deemed incompetent by his own regiment and dismissed in disgrace. Finally, at the age of 28, just 15 months after inheriting the grand title of Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, he died alone under mysterious and shameful circumstances thousands of miles from home. The Britain of 1914 was the heart of a global empire, a nation of supreme confidence with a rigid social hierarchy. At the pinnacle of this society was the royal family, but it was a distinctly German one. Their name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and they were related to nearly every royal house in Europe. King George V's first cousins included both Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. That family network was supposed to guarantee peace. They were wrong. As nationalism and ambition plunged Europe into the abyss, the web of kinship designed to prevent war became a web of enemies. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Just 5 days later, amid the roar of mobilization and the first tremors of the most brutal war in human history, Alastair Arthur Windsor was born. He drew his first breath in a world set ablaze, and the flames of that war would forge his tragic destiny from his very first days. The infant prince's lineage was a map of British royalty. He was not just a royal. He was a convergence of two of the most senior lines of the family. His father, Prince Arthur, was the son of Prince Arthur, 1st Duke of Connaught and Strathearn. The Duke was the third and favorite son of Queen Victoria, a man who had dedicated his life to the army and the empire, serving as a field marshal and as Governor-General of Canada. He was a living, breathing link to the Victorian age, widely admired for his dignity and sense of duty. Prince Arthur, Alastair's father, followed in these formidable footsteps. A professional soldier, he was respected, handsome, and dutiful, the model of an aristocratic officer. Through this paternal line, Alastair was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. His mother's line was, if anything, even grander in terms of precedence. She was born Princess Alexandra of Fife, the daughter of Alexander Duff, 1st Duke of Fife, and Louise the Princess Royal. Louise was the eldest daughter of King Edward VII, who was Victoria's eldest son. This meant that through his mother, Alastair was also a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, but through the senior male line. His mother was a remarkable woman in her own right. When her father, the Duke of Fife, died in 1912 without a son, a special remainder in the letters patent creating the dukedom allowed the title to pass to her. She became the 2nd Duchess of Fife in her own right, a rare female holder of such a senior peerage. Furthermore, she was not merely a society princess. She was a trained nurse and, upon the outbreak of war, immediately began working at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, tending to the horrifically wounded men being brought back from the front. Alastair was therefore born into the heart of the establishment, doubly descended from the great Queen-Empress, a nexus of the Victorian legacy and the new Edwardian era. His christening on September 1, 1914, held in the drawing room of his parents' home, was a testament to his rank. His list of godparents was staggering. There was his great-uncle, the reigning monarch, King George V. There was King Alfonso XIII of Spain, whose British-born wife, Victoria Eugenie, was Alastair's cousin. There was his paternal grandfather, the revered Duke of Connaught, and his maternal great-grandmother, the beloved Dowager Queen Alexandra, widow of Edward VII. It was a ceremony that looked to the past, with its weight of tradition, and to a future that was assumed to be one of imperial glory and steadfast duty for the new prince. But the war changed everything. It reshaped the map of Europe, toppled empires, and fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchs and their people. While Alastair was an infant, his father was serving on the Western Front as an aide-de-camp to Field Marshals Sir John French and Sir Douglas Haig. He was in the thick of it, witnessing the slaughter on an industrial scale. His mother spent her days in the wards of St. Mary's, confronted with the brutal human cost of the conflict. The war was not a distant affair for this family. It was an immediate, daily reality. And it was a war that brought a simmering identity crisis for the British monarchy to a boiling point. As the casualty list grew longer and anti-German sentiment intensified, the public began to look with increasing suspicion at their German-named royal family. German shepherd dogs were renamed Alsatians, and people with German surnames faced persecution. In this climate, the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was a profound liability. The final straw came in March 1917, when German bombers, monstrous twin-engine planes called the Gotha G4, began carrying out devastating air raids on London. The name of the royal house was now the same as the name of the machine dropping bombs on British citizens. King George V, a pragmatist above all else, knew he had to act decisively. On July 17, 1917, he issued a royal proclamation that would change the face of the monarchy forever. He, and all British descendants of Queen Victoria, would relinquish all their German titles and adopt a new, unequivocally English surname, Windsor. The German roots were to be severed, at least in name. The House of Windsor was born, but the king didn't stop there. Advised that a more streamlined, less sprawling monarchy would be more popular, he also issued letters patent on November 30th, 1917, which restricted the titles of prince and princess and the style of royal highness. The new rule was precise. The titles would henceforth be limited to the children of a sovereign, the male line grandchildren of a sovereign, and the eldest son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. At 3 years old, while Alastair was busy with a world of toys and nursery rhymes, the world of adults decided his fate. With the cold stroke of a pen, his great-uncle, the king, redrew the lines of the royal family. And in this royal reshuffle, the little prince fell through the cracks. The change was immediate and absolute. His Highness Prince Alastair of Connaught ceased to exist. Of course, a toddler could not understand the language of a letters patent, but he did not need to understand the words to one day feel their weight. The title was gone, and in its place a void was created that would follow him, haunt him, and never truly be filled. The stage was set for a personal struggle with identity, duty, and belonging that would follow him to his tragic, lonely end. The Great War did more than just redraw the map of Europe. It shattered the psychological landscape of a generation. The old certainties, the unquestioning belief in God, king, and empire had been drowned in the mud of Passchendaele and bled out on the wire of the Somme. For those who survived, the world they returned to was irrevocably changed. A profound sense of disillusionment gave rise to a frantic, almost desperate pursuit of pleasure. This was the Jazz Age, the era of the bright young things, a time of cocktail parties, fast cars, and a conscious rejection of the stuffy Victorian values that had led the world into catastrophe. For the British royal family, this new world presented a challenge. They were the ultimate symbol of the old order, of tradition and continuity. Led by the staid and steadfast King George V, they navigated the hedonism of the 1920s with a cautious reserve embodying a sense of duty that seemed increasingly old-fashioned to some. It was into this strange New Britain, a nation grappling with its own grief and identity, that the young Alastair Windsor, the boy who was once a prince, began to grow up. His childhood would be shaped not by the frantic energy of the new age, but by the long, imposing shadows of the old one, and by the notable absence of the two people who should have been his guides. Alastair's world was one of immense, almost unimaginable privilege, but it was a world dominated by the elderly and the absent. The most significant male figure in his early life was his paternal grandfather, Prince Arthur, the first Duke of Connaught. By the 1920s, the Duke was in his 70s, a widower whose beloved wife, Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, had died of Spanish flu in 1917. He was a living embodiment of the Victorian era, Queen Victoria's last surviving and favorite son. His homes, Clarence House in London and the sprawling country estate of Bagshot Park in Surrey, were Alastair's homes for much of his youth. Life in the Duke's household was a world away from the Roaring Twenties. It was a place of rigid formality where meals were served with military punctuality and protocol was observed to the letter. The Duke was a kindly man, but he was a product of his time, emotionally reserved. A man who had spent his entire life in uniform, for whom duty was the supreme virtue. For a young, sensitive boy, this environment must have been both awe-inspiring and intimidating. He was surrounded by the relics of a glorious past, portraits of royal ancestors, cabinets filled with imperial medals, souvenirs from a life spent in service to the crown. It was a daily unspoken lesson in the weight of the legacy he was expected to uphold. While his grandfather represented the royal, military side of his heritage, the influence of his maternal grandfather, Alexander Duff, 1st Duke of Fife, was also a constant presence, despite his death in 1912. This was the legacy Alastair inherited through his mother, Princess Alexandra. It was a different kind of power, that of the great Scottish territorial magnate. The Fife inheritance included vast estates, most notably Mar Lodge in Aberdeenshire, set amidst the breathtaking wilderness of the Cairngorms. It was a world of deer stalking, salmon fishing, and rugged landscapes, a stark contrast to the formal gardens of Bagshot Park. This dual inheritance placed Alastair in a unique position. He was the heir to a great royal dukedom, and simultaneously the heir to one of the richest non-royal dukedoms in the land. He was a prince of two houses, Connaught and Fife, a burden of expectation that would be heavy for any child to bear. Compounding this was the prolonged absence of his parents during his most formative years. In November 1920, when Alastair was 6 years old, his father, Prince Arthur, was appointed Governor-General of the Union of South Africa. It was a prestigious and demanding role, a key position within the empire. Prince Arthur and Princess Alexandra duly sailed for Cape Town, where they would remain for the next 4 years. It was a common practice for colonial administrators to leave their children to be educated in Britain, and Alastair was no exception. From the age of 6 to 10, his parents were figures on the other side of the world. Their presence felt primarily through letters, photographs, and occasional brief visits home. He was left in the care of his grandparents and a retinue of nannies and tutors. While he was undoubtedly well cared for in a material sense, the emotional impact of this parental distance cannot be overstated. His father became a remote, heroic figure, a decorated soldier representing the king in a faraway land. This distance could easily have magnified the pressure Alastair felt to live up to his father's image, an image built more on legend than on daily interaction. His mother, Princess Alexandra, was a complex figure, naturally shy and retiring. She was also a woman of great substance. her dedication as a wartime nurse testament to her strong sense of duty. However, she was also frequently plagued by ill health, and the formal, hands-off style of aristocratic parenting of the era meant that she was likely not a demonstrative, hands-on mother. For her only child, an intelligent and perhaps introverted boy, this combination of an absent father and a reserved mother could have fostered a profound sense of loneliness. He was the sole focus of his parents' dynastic hopes, yet he was navigating his unusual childhood largely on his own. He lacked the rough-and-tumble camaraderie of his royal cousins, the children of King George V, who grew up as a close-knit, if boisterous, sibling group. Alastair was an only child in a world of adults, a quiet boy in silent, cavernous houses, perpetually reminded of who he was, who he had been, and who he was supposed to become. When it came time for Alastair to attend secondary school, his parents made a decision that was both surprising and deeply revealing. He would not be sent to Eton College, the ancient and formidable institution that had educated generations of aristocrats and royals, including many of his own relatives. Nor would he be sent to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, the path chosen for his cousins, the future King George VI and Duke of Kent. Instead, in the late 1920s, Alastair was enrolled at Bryanston, a new and radically progressive school in Dorset. The choice of Bryanston was a profound statement. Founded in 1928, it was deliberately established as an antidote to the rigid, often brutal, traditions of the established English public school system. Where Eton focused on classics, conformity, and the creation of imperial administrators, Bryanston championed individualism, creativity, and modern educational theories. It operated on the Dalton Plan, a system that encouraged pupils to take responsibility for their own learning, managing their own timetables, and working in consultation with their teachers. The arts were valued as highly as academics, and the relationship between boys and masters was far more informal and collaborative than at other schools. Why would Prince Arthur and Princess Alexandra choose such an unconventional environment for their son? It strongly suggests they recognized that Alastair was not cut from the same cloth as his military forebears. Perhaps they saw in him a sensitivity, an individuality that would be crushed by the conformist culture of Eton. It may have been a thoughtful, compassionate attempt to allow their son to flourish in an environment that valued the boy over the system. Alternatively, it could be interpreted in a less positive light. Perhaps they felt that, as he was no longer a prince, the Eton path was no longer necessary or even appropriate. Or, more worryingly, perhaps there were early signs that Alastair simply lacked the academic or personal fortitude for a more traditional competitive school. Whatever the reason, the decision further isolated him from his royal peers. He was once again on a different path, an outlier in a family that prized conformity. One can only speculate about his time at Bryanston. Did he find a haven there, a place where being the Earl of Macduff mattered less than his own interests and talents? Or did his title and background make him an object of curiosity, setting him apart even in a school that championed the individual? It is possible that this liberal education nurtured his softer side, but left him ill-prepared for the unyielding reality of the world he was still destined to enter. Because after the progressive experiment of Bryanston came the inevitable predestined next step, the great leveler, the forge of officers, the Royal Military College Sandhurst. But the dream of Bryanston, the brief sunlit moment where his individuality was valued, had to end. He was then thrown into the Royal Military College Sandhurst. If Bryanston was a gentle stream, Sandhurst was a raging torrent. If Bryanston was a conversation, Sandhurst was a screamed command. The scent of books and paint was replaced by the stench of sweat, polish, and fear. It was not a transition, it was an eradication. The sensitive, artistic boy he was to be broken down and remade into the soldier he could never be. It was here that the man Alastair was, and the man he was supposed to be, declared war on each other. Sandhurst in the early 1930s was an institution steeped in a century of tradition. It was designed to take boys from privileged backgrounds and through a process of intense physical hardship, relentless discipline, and indoctrination into the officer's code of honor, turn them into leaders of men. The training was brutal. Days began before dawn with punishing drills on the parade square. Cadets were subjected to screamed orders from drill sergeants, grueling cross-country runs, and endless inspections, where a speck of dust on a uniform could result in a weekend of confinement to barracks. For a young man from the gentle, individualistic world of Bryanston, this must have been a profound culture shock. He was no longer the Earl of Macduff, a boy with a unique background. He was just another cadet, expected to perform, to obey, and to endure without complaint. And everywhere he looked, the legacy of his family would have been inescapable. Portraits of his grandfather, the field marshal, would have hung in the great halls. His instructors would have all known of his father, the decorated war hero. The pressure to not just succeed but to excel would have been immense. It is here, in the crucible of Sandhurst, that the first concrete signs of Alastair's unsuitability for a military life likely began to emerge. Theo Aronson, the royal biographer, would later describe the adult Alastair as a diffident and unmilitary-looking young man. These are not qualities that thrive at Sandhurst. The ideal cadet was tough, assertive, and physically robust, with a natural air of command. A quiet, sensitive, or hesitant nature would be quickly identified as a weakness. Did he struggle to keep up on the assault course? Did his voice fail to carry on the parade ground? Was he simply too gentle, too unassuming, to command the instant respect that the institution demanded? We lack detailed records of his performance, but the later accounts of his incompetence from military and royal sources strongly suggest that the problems did not begin in Canada, but much earlier. Sandhurst was likely where the dissonance between the man he was and the man he was supposed to be became a painful, undeniable reality, both to his instructors and, most critically, to himself. Despite any private struggles, he completed the course. On the 31st of January 1935, Alastair Windsor, the Earl of Macduff, received the King's commission. At the age of 20, he was officially a second lieutenant in the British Army. He was posted to the Royal Scots Greys, a famous and highly prestigious cavalry regiment. It was a moment that should have been the culmination of his entire upbringing, a moment of immense pride. He had successfully passed through the forge. The choice of regiment was, of course, no accident. The Royal Scots Greys was his father's old regiment. He was not just joining the army, he was being placed directly into his father's shadow. As he prepared to sail for his first posting in Egypt, a key outpost of the empire, he was carrying an almost impossible burden. He had the title, the uniform, and the commission. The world now expected him to be a Connaught. The question that hung in the air was whether he had the character to match the name. His next posting, in the heat and social whirl of North Africa, would provide the first part of the answer, and it would not be the one anyone was hoping for. For a newly commissioned officer in the British Army of the mid-1930s, there were few postings as evocative or as critical as Egypt. It was the keystone of the British Empire, the strategic linchpin that protected the Suez Canal, the vital artery to India and the Far East. Though nominally an independent kingdom, Egypt was, in reality, a client state, its politics and defense dominated by the immense British military presence headquartered in Cairo. It was a land of ancient wonders and modern political intrigue, a place where the authority of the empire was projected with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Into this complex and sun-drenched world, in 1935, stepped 2nd Lieutenant Alastair Windsor, Earl of Macduff. He was now an officer in one of the Army's most storied cavalry regiments, the Royal Scots Greys. For Alastair, this was the moment of truth. He had survived the brutal training of Sandhurst and was now a professional soldier, just like his father and grandfather before him. Egypt offered a new beginning, a chance to finally prove himself away from the direct oversight of his family. It was an opportunity to forge his own identity, to become more than just Prince Arthur's boy. But this land of sun and sand would become less a place of reinvention and more a gilded cage, a theater where his inadequacies would be thrown into sharp and undeniable relief. The Royal Scots Greys that Alastair joined were a regiment in transition. For centuries, their identity had been tied to the horse, their defining moment being the legendary costly charge at the Battle of Waterloo. But the age of the cavalry charge was over, a lesson learned brutally on the Western Front. The 1930s was the era of mechanization, and the regiment was swapping its horses for armored cars. This was a profound cultural shift, demanding new skills, gunnery, mechanics, radio operation, that were a world away from traditional horsemanship. For the officers, life was a strange mix of rugged frontier soldiering and colonial luxury. A typical day might involve a long-range patrol deep into the western desert, a hot, dusty, and uncomfortable business, living on rations and sleeping under the stars. They were policing a vast and often lawless territory, a critical buffer against the ambitions of Mussolini's Italy in neighboring Libya. Yet, after returning to their barracks in Cairo, they would shed their dusty uniforms, bathe, and step into another world entirely. This was the world of the Cairo social scene, an opulent and often hedonistic bubble of expatriate life. The epicenter was the Jazeera Sporting Club, an oasis of green polo fields, tennis courts, and swimming pools in the heart of the city. Evenings were a blur of cocktail parties at the famous Shepherd's Hotel, formal dinners at the British Embassy, and dances that lasted until dawn. For a young, handsome officer with a title and a direct connection to the royal family, Alastair would have been, on paper, a star attraction. He was an eligible bachelor of the highest rank, and the mothers of debutantes would have marked him on their social calendars with great interest. But Alastair was not a social star. His quiet, diffident nature, which may have been an asset in the progressive halls of Bryanston, was a distinct liability in this loud, confident, and often superficial world. Socializing was part of the job for an officer. It was where connections were made and reputations were forged. It required an easy charm, a ready supply of small talk, and a certain social bravado that Alastair simply did not possess. One can easily imagine him at these glittering parties, standing awkwardly at the edge of a room, nursing a drink, overwhelmed by the noise and the pressure to perform. It is in environments like this, surrounded by people but feeling utterly alone, that a reliance on alcohol as a social crutch often begins. A drink or two could quiet the anxiety, making the forced bonhomie more bearable. It's a common and insidious trap, and for a young man already struggling with his own sense of self-worth, it would have been a tempting one. More damagingly, his professional reputation within the regiment was beginning to falter. The Army is a meritocracy of competence, and soldiers, particularly the hardened, long-serving non-commissioned officers, have an unerring ability to spot weakness in their superiors. An officer who is hesitant in giving orders, who struggles with navigation during desert exercises, or who simply lacks that innate quality of command will quickly lose respect. The quiet whispers would have started in the sergeant's mess, then moved to the officer's mess. The Earl of Macduff, Prince Arthur's boy, was not a natural soldier. He lacked the steel, the snap that was expected. He was, in the blunt and unforgiving parlance of the army, no good. This professional failure, combined with his social awkwardness, would have created a vicious cycle of eroding confidence and increasing isolation. While Alastair was struggling in Egypt, events were unfolding at home that would shake his world. His father, Prince Arthur of Connaught, had been battling stomach cancer for some time. On the 12th of September 1938, at the age of just 55, he died. Prince Arthur had lived a life of quiet distinction. He had served his country in 2 wars and carried out his royal duties with a steadfast dignity that befitted a grandson of Queen Victoria. His premature death was a genuine loss to the royal family. For Alastair, the news received by cable in Cairo must have been a devastating blow. He was 24 years old. He had lost his father, the distant, heroic figure whose approval he had so long sought and whose military legacy he was so clearly failing to uphold. The death of a parent often forces a young person into a new stage of maturity, but for Alastair, it may have simply left him feeling more adrift than ever. The central pillar of his world, the man who represented the ideal he was supposed to achieve, was gone. His father's death also elevated his own status. He was now the direct heir to his grandfather, the aged Duke of Connaught. The day was drawing nearer when he would inherit that great and storied title, a prospect that was likely more terrifying than exciting. As Alastair mourned, the world was accelerating towards another cataclysm. Adolf Hitler's ambitions were dragging Europe to the brink. The Munich crisis of 1938, Chamberlain's Peace for Our Time, had only delayed the inevitable. For the British forces in Egypt, the threat was no longer abstract. Italy, now formally allied with Germany, had a massive army in Libya, directly threatening the Suez Canal. The pace of training intensified. A sense of grim purpose replaced the more relaxed peacetime routine. For the officers and men of the Royal Scots Greys, this was what they had been preparing for. The prospect of real combat was now a certainty. On July 14, 1939, Alastair was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. It was most likely a standard promotion based on time served, but it was another step up the ladder of responsibility. 2 months later, on September 1st, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days after that, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The Royal Scots Greys would soon be thrown into the desperate battles of the North African campaign, where they would fight with great distinction. But that was not to be Alastair's fate. As his regiment prepared for war, a different path was being prepared for him. In the cold professional calculus of a military force preparing for a life-or-death struggle, there is no room for sentiment. Every officer must be someone his men can rely on, someone who can make a clear decision under fire. A commander who has doubts about a subordinate officer cannot afford to take them into battle. It is in this harsh light that Alastair's next move must be seen. Sometime in late 1939 or early 1940, Lieutenant the Earl of Macduff was informed that he was being transferred. He was not being sent to a training unit in Britain or to another front. He was being posted to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, to serve as an aide-de-camp to the Governor-General. This is the moment that Sir Alan Lascelles would later describe so bluntly. His regiment had pushed him out. A transfer of this nature for a young, healthy officer at the beginning of a war was not a promotion or a reward. It was a very clear, if politely disguised signal that he was not wanted at the front. It was a way to solve the problem of a well-connected but incompetent officer without the scandal of a resignation or a formal finding of unsuitability. They were moving him sideways into a role where it was assumed he could do little harm. On the surface, the posting looked prestigious. The Governor-General was Major General the Earl of Athlone, a distinguished veteran of several wars, and more importantly, the brother of Queen Mary. His wife was Princess Alice of Albany, one of Queen Victoria's last surviving granddaughters, and Alastair's own first cousin once removed. It was a family affair. Furthermore, Alastair's own grandfather had been a much-loved Governor-General of Canada. There was a pleasing symmetry to it all. He was being sent into the care of his kinsmen to a safe and respectable job far from the dangers of the war. He would have crossed the Atlantic in a convoy, dodging German U-boats to arrive in a country that, while fully committed to the war effort, was a world away from the Blitz and the blackout. His new home was Rideau Hall, the stately official residence of the Governor-General. It was a grand, sprawling mansion that functioned as a kind of court in exile. With the dangers of travel, it became the center of royal and diplomatic activity in North America, a constant hub of visits from Allied leaders, government officials, and displaced European royalty. His new role as an aide-de-camp was primarily administrative and social. He would help manage the Governor-General's diary, reply to correspondence, and act as a ceremonial escort at official functions. It was a job that required discretion, organizational skill, and social grace. But his new employers were not simply figureheads. The Earl of Athlone was a tough, no-nonsense soldier of the old school. Princess Alice was famously sharp, intelligent, and perceptive. They were running a vital wartime office, representing the king in the most important dominion, and they expected the highest standards from their staff. Alastair had escaped the professional judgment of his regiment in the desert, but he had unwittingly stepped into a new, more intimate, and perhaps even more demanding theater of scrutiny. He was now living and working under the watchful eyes of his own senior relatives. His every action, his every mistake, would be observed at close quarters. For a young man already burdened by a sense of failure, this new posting was not the safe harbor it appeared to be. It was a pressure cooker, and it would be here, in the cold of a Canadian winter, that his life would completely and tragically unravel. For Alastair Windsor, the journey across the war-torn Atlantic was more than just a geographical relocation. It was a passage from one form of judgment to another. He had left behind the professional scrutiny of his regiment, a world of desert patrols and military discipline where he had been found wanting. He was now entering a world of diplomatic protocol, social nuance, and political importance, a world where the battlefield was the dinner table and a misstep could have international repercussions. This was Rideau Hall, the heart of Canada's war effort and the King's official home in the Dominion. For Alastair, it was meant to be a safe harbor, a respectable escape. Instead, it would become his final stage, a place of intense and intimate scrutiny where his personal failings would lead to his ultimate and tragic downfall. Life at Rideau Hall during the Second World War was anything but a quiet, ceremonial backwater. It was a critical nerve center of the Allied war effort. Canada's contribution in terms of soldiers, industry, and resources was immense, and the Governor-General was the King's personal representative in this vital partnership. The residence was constantly hosting a stream of high-level visitors. Winston Churchill made historic visits there to confer with Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Allied military leaders came to coordinate strategy. and a steady flow of exiled European royals, fleeing the Nazi conquest of their homelands, found a temporary haven within its walls. Crown Princess Juliana of the Netherlands and her children were among the long-term guests. In this high-stakes environment, every detail mattered. The staff of Rideau Hall was expected to perform with flawless efficiency and discretion. The man and woman presiding over this court were not mere figureheads. The Earl of Athlone, a major general and Queen Mary's brother, was a soldier of the old school, disciplined, exacting, and with a deep-seated intolerance for laziness or incompetence. He had a job to do, and he expected his subordinates to do theirs without fault. His wife, Princess Alice, was perhaps even more formidable. A granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she possessed a sharp intellect, a keen eye for detail, and a pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to her duties. Royal biographer Theo Aronson, who interviewed her staff years later, painted a picture of a woman who was observant, highly capable, and not given to sentimentality. While she was Alastair's cousin, their shared blood would not afford him any special protection if he failed to meet the standards she expected. As an aide-de-camp, Alastair's duties were varied. He would have been responsible for helping to manage the Athlones' complex schedules, greeting distinguished guests, handling correspondence, and standing in attendance at countless receptions, dinners, and ceremonies. It was a role that demanded precision, social grace, and an impeccable appearance. It was, in short, everything that Alastair was not. His natural diffidence and shyness would have made the constant social demands an ordeal. His likely lack of organizational skill would have led to embarrassing mistakes, a misplaced document, a misremembered name, a forgotten appointment. These may seem like small errors, but in the rigid, protocol-driven world of a vice-regal court, they would have been glaring signs of unsuitability. The Athlones, according to Aronson, quickly grew disappointed with their new ADC. He was simply not up to the task. They found him to be a sad and unsatisfactory presence in their household. As his confidence faltered under their stern, watchful eyes, his reliance on alcohol almost certainly increased. It was no longer just a social lubricant for parties, but a private refuge from a daily reality of failure and disapproval. The warning signs would have been there: a slurring of words, a lack of focus, the smell of spirits on his breath at an inappropriate time. For the abstemious and disciplined Athlones, this would have been the final unforgivable sin. In the midst of this personal and professional decline, an event occurred in England that, in a cruelly ironic twist, elevated Alastair to the highest rank he would ever hold. On the 16th of January 1942, his grandfather, Prince Arthur, the first Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, died peacefully at his home, Bagshot Park. He was 91 years old. With his passing, a great historical chapter closed. He was the last surviving son of Queen Victoria, a man who had been a prince for his entire long life, a living link to the Victorian Empire at its zenith. His death was front-page news around the world, the end of an era, and at that moment, thousands of miles away in Ottawa, the title passed to his grandson. Lieutenant Alastair Arthur Windsor, the disgraced officer and unsatisfactory ADC, became His Grace, the Duke of Connaught and Strathearn and Earl of Sussex. The irony was crushing. Just as he was proving himself utterly unfit for the responsibilities of a junior army officer, he was being handed one of the most senior and respected dukedoms in the kingdom. The title was not a reward, it was the ultimate burden. The name Duke of Connaught was synonymous with his grandfather's legacy of impeccable duty, honor, and public service. It was a mantle of greatness. For Alastair, it must have felt like a suit of armor that was several sizes too large. its weight exposing his own frailty. The new title didn't empower him, it diminished him, starkly illuminating the vast gulf between the man he was and the man that his name now declared him to be. His every failure was no longer just a personal failing. It was a stain on a noble and historic title. His inheritance of the dukedom did nothing to improve his standing with the Athlons. If anything, it likely made his incompetence even more galling to them. He was now a duke, a peer of the realm, and his behavior was a disgrace not only to their household, but to the entire royal family. Their patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. This brings us to the final brutal rejection, recorded with devastating clarity in the diaries of Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, the king's private secretary. Lascelles did not mince words. Alastair's regiment had already pushed him out, and then he added the Earl of Athlone had chucked him out. He was fired by his own family. It was the point of no return. A duke with no duties, an officer with no command, an outcast in the king's own house. He was trapped in a silent, gilded prison of his own failure, waiting for a ship to carry him home to a future that held nothing but shame. But what awaited him there? A grieving mother, a royal family aware of his disgrace, and a country at war in which there was no place for him. The sense of shame, hopelessness, and utter isolation must have been absolute. The final act of Alastair's life played out on the night of April 25th, 1943. He was 28 years old. He was alone in his room at Rideau Hall. The precise details of his final hours are lost to history, but based on the accounts of Lascelles and Aronson, a clear and tragic picture emerges. He was almost certainly drinking heavily. It was a cold spring night in Ottawa, the kind of night where the winter chill still lingers in the air. His window was open. Sometime during the night he fell out of it. On the morning of April 26th, he was found dead. Theo Aronson's account states he was found on the floor of his room, having died of hypothermia. This detail for years seemed puzzling. How does one freeze to death inside a heated house? But Lascelles's diary entry clarifies the horror of the situation. He didn't just die in his room, he fell from the window and perished of hypothermia overnight. This paints a truly grim picture. He was likely lying unconscious or incapacitated, either completely outside on the ground below, or perhaps trapped half in and half out of the window, exposed to the freezing night air for hours. No one heard him fall. No one came to check on him. He died alone in the cold at the official residence of the king's representative. The central, unanswerable question is this: was it an accident or was it suicide? The case for an accident is plausible. In a drunken stupor, he could have gone to the window for fresh air, lost his balance, and toppled out. The fall may have knocked him unconscious or left him too injured and disoriented to seek help. In his intoxicated state, and with the shock of the fall and the cold, hypothermia would have set in with lethal speed. But the argument for suicide is psychologically powerful. This was a young man who had reached the absolute end of his rope. He had been rejected by his regiment and fired by his own family. He had inherited a great title only to disgrace it. He faced a future of shame and purposelessness. In a mind clouded by alcohol and consumed by despair, the open window may have presented itself as the only escape. A fall could be seen as an ambiguous act, one that might spare his mother the definitive stigma of suicide. We will never know what was in his heart in that final desperate moment. What we do know is what happened next. The discovery of the Duke's body would have caused immediate panic and a crisis at the highest level. The truth was unthinkable. It was sordid, tragic, and, in wartime, politically toxic. The machinery of the establishment immediately swung into action to control the narrative. The decision was made to conceal the truth, both from the public and from his family back home. A story was crafted, one that was dignified, simple, and untrue. His Grace. The Duke of Connaught in Strathearn, it was announced, had died unexpectedly of natural causes while on active service. The messy, heartbreaking reality of his end was erased, replaced by a clean, respectable fiction. The final act of Alastair's life was to have his own story taken from him. Alastair Windsor's death caused the prestigious royal title of Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, a title created by Queen Victoria for her favorite son, to vanish completely. He held it for only 469 days. With his passing, a direct link to the Victorian age was severed. So what is Alastair's legacy? His life had no great impact on historical events. Instead, it is a tragic cautionary tale about the price paid by those born into royalty who do not fit the mold. He was a quiet, sensitive man in a family of soldiers and sovereigns. The path was set for him, and when he failed, the system cast him aside. His story also reveals how systematically the royal family concealed the truth to protect its image, especially during wartime. The reality of his sad death was sacrificed for the greater good of the firm. Ultimately, the tragedy of Alastair Windsor is not his death, but his life, one lived in the shadow of great men and expectations he could never meet. He is a reminder that behind the glamour of the crown, there are always personal struggles and broken hearts left in the shadows.